Hi there, I'm Jonathan Raven and welcome to Ravenomics. Today I'm going to explain what bonds are. Now don't worry, I promise you that I will not use a single number. Stocks and shares, also known as equities, are the most famous type of investment. But what on earth is a bond? Well, think about buying a house. Your down payment is your equity in your home, while your mortgage is a debt you borrowed from the bank. Each month you pay interest back to the bank. Why? Because the bank has taken a risk on your ability to repay the mortgage on time. The greater the risk of you defaulting, the higher your interest rate. The lower the risk of you defaulting, the lower your interest rate. Now, bonds work in the same way as a mortgage. However, rather than taking a bank loan, businesses borrow their debts from the public at large. This is called issuing a bond. And just like equities, corporate bonds are available for professional investors and the public to buy and sell. Companies likely to repay their debts on time will enjoy a low interest rate. Those less likely to pay their debts on time pay a higher interest rate. Now, governments also issue bonds. Governments tax citizens and use our money to fund state functions such as welfare, defense, and education. But what happens when a government spends more than its tax receipts? Just like your mortgage, the government borrows money to fund the gap. The state issues bonds, and the public can choose whether to buy those bonds and at what interest rate to charge the government. In industry jargon, we call these sovereign bonds. Just like corporate bonds, countries more likely to repay their debts on time will enjoy a low interest rate. Those less likely to repay their debts pay a higher interest rate. In industry jargon, we call this the yield. Just like equities, bonds trade on a public market in real time. Interest rates on a bond go up and down depending on the public's assessment of the likelihood of the government repaying them. You might have seen in the news over the past few days that interest rates on sovereign bonds have risen across developed markets. UK sovereign bond yields are the highest they've been in a couple of decades. In other words, investors are beginning to lose their faith in the UK's ability to repay them. Now, how did we get here? In June of 26, the Office for National Statistics estimated that the UK's sovereign debt is now greater than the annual output of the entire UK economy. So there's only one way to reduce the debt, and that's cut government expenses. Some might argue for rising taxes to plug this gap, but the data in fact shows that higher taxes usually reduce the nominal amount the Treasury collects. Between April 25 and March 2026, the government spent far more than it took in taxes and borrowed billions and billions to plug the gap. In fact, the UK's debt exceeds the budget of any government department. Now, the government must pay interest back to the members of the public who bought its sovereign bonds. And today, those interest payments alone exceed the budgets of every government department except the NHS and social care. We spend more on interest than we do on education, defence, transport, and the Home Office. So what happens next? Ferguson's law, named for the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, says a great power that spends more servicing its national debt than it spends on defence is unlikely to remain a great power for long. In the 1780s, France paid twice as much interest on its bonds as it did on the War Department. The public lost faith in the country's ability to repay its debts and consequently stopped buying French sovereign bonds. This was no doubt one of the catalysts for the French Revolution. The British Empire collapsed under the same pressure. Between 1920 and 1937, interest payments exceeded defence spending every year. When Greece adopted the euro, the public calculated that Greece was just as likely to repay its debts as Germany. This allowed Greece to issue sovereign bonds at a relatively low interest rate. Now, politicians like to borrow and spend because it increases their chances of winning the next election. The Greek government saw an opportunity to borrow at a low interest rate and kept borrowing and borrowing until investors said enough. They lost faith in the Greek government's ability to repay its debts. The government were left with only one option: to cut expenses. And the Greek public suffered terribly. Unemployment and poverty skyrocketed, and over half of young people were unemployed. State pensions were slashed, health budgets were slashed, and the banking system collapsed. What's more, from a national perspective, Greece's democratically elected government was forced to surrender political autonomy. Major decisions required the permission of the European Union, the European Central Bank, and also the International Monetary Fund. Now, given all that, would you lend your money to the British government?